Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on how to use collaborative math teams in the math classroom. My name is Nikki Lynham, and I'm a teacher in the Greater Victoria School District, as well as co-founder of Educating Now. And one of the best parts about my job is I actually get to work in lots of different classrooms in the school that I'm at. And so we spent really about 2 years trying to make these math groups work. And after a lot of trial and error, we finally found a recipe for success. And that's what I am going to be sharing with you today. So today's webinar is really an overview. And we do offer on Educating Now a full course. It's a 12-part course, and I'll be referring to that as we go if you're interested. And I'll be finishing up with talking about that. But I also want to, before we get too far into this, I want to introduce you to Hugo, who is moderating this, and he will be able to relay any questions you have as we go to me. So let's say hi to Hugo.
Hi, everyone.
There he is. This is our first webinar where Hugo is coming remotely. So hopefully everything works according to plan. So we'll get started here in just a minute. So just a reminder that if you want to be asking questions as we go, please do not hesitate to jump in, ask those questions, and Hugo will interrupt when you have those questions. We will be sending you a playback of this tomorrow, as well as an offer for a discount on that course that I was referring to. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to screen share with you here. I can do this properly, my PowerPoint, and we will get started. Okay, so that's a bit about me if you want to read further. So first thing that I want to share with you are the two books that I read. And I read these pretty much cover to cover, and they were both what informed me about how to do this in the math class. I recommend them both, especially Joe Boaler's book, Mathematical Mindsets. It's only about $20, and it is so useful for teaching math in general, but especially for using these teams. And in there, they refer to it as complex instruction, which it isn't as complex as it sounds, but we've certainly broken it down into kind of more easy step-by-step process for you here. So this is what we're going to be talking about for today's webinar. First, we're going to look at the benefits of using collaborative math teams, both for the students and for teachers. We're going to look at setting up the team so that every student is engaged and held accountable. And that's one of the things that I love about these teams is it basically uses peer pressure, but in a positive way to help keep the students accountable. I'm going to walk you through an example of a task that I actually used in a grade 8 class. And I'm going to walk you through what happened and the problems we had and how we overcame those problems, because it was really similar to what happened in the other classes. So we can use the same approach. We're going to look at when and how to use direct instruction for whole class or team intervention. And finally, we're going to look at why and how using these teams helps to differentiate to meet more of your learners' needs. Okay, so first off, the #1 biggest benefit for students is definitely the engagement. Every teacher that I had the opportunity to collaborate with when I use these teams in their classrooms, when I asked them afterwards for feedback or even during, I said, what are you noticing? What's the biggest thing that's jumping out that's different from when you taught without using the teams? And the first thing every single teacher said was the student engagement is through the roof. And especially those struggling learners who are the ones, as we know, that tend to opt out. And they do so sometimes in obvious ways by putting their head down or by fiddling with toys or something, but they also do it really subtly sometimes. So I notice, those students that they're basically not paying attention, but pretending as though they are. And we know who they are. They're the ones that put their hand up the second that you ask them to do a task on their own, because they actually haven't been following along and they don't know what to do. So student engagement, especially the struggling learners, but all students, was the biggest benefit for sure. Also, we noticed a huge improvement in problem-solving skills, because to be quite honest with you, most of our students didn't really have problem-solving skills. They you know, they looked for clue words, but that often didn't involve looking at the meaning, and they just had very limited strategies. We also noticed a really big improvement with their critical thinking, their ability to analyze if a solution made sense, to check if things are actually reasonable. The communication, again, totally surpassed my expectations. I was quite amazed at how the grades 6, 7, and 8s could communicate their mathematical thinking so clearly. It was quite amazing. And their ability to collaborate, because they did not come in to this process knowing how to collaborate well at all. And finally, we saw an awful lot of creativity in how they approached the different problems, which was wonderful to see, especially in a math class. We also saw a lot less frustration, and part of that is students didn't have to wait for help. They were getting the help they needed right away throughout the entire class. So again, if I'm talking about those struggling learners, they are getting support, peer teaching the entire class, and it made a huge difference in their achievement. We noticed that they developed much stronger conceptual understanding of the concepts. So we moved away from memorizing and just practicing procedures. And we looked at all of these different aspects you can see here in this picture. So we used concrete manipulatives. You know, for fractions, we used fraction circles and Cuisenaire rods, and we used base 10 blocks when we worked with decimals in grade 6s. We used pictorial drawings, number lines, things like that, models. And we used in-context problems, and if it was an abstract problem, we created an in-context problem. So we had the verbal aspect there, and of course we used the symbolic, which is kind of the more, that's kind of the normal way you'd think about math. Symbolic is using the numbers and variables. Here are some student testimonials. So this was, these were all students from a grade 8 class. And Garrett said, hearing other people's concepts and ideas helped me understand. Olivia said, I think it built a better understanding for me by explaining it to my group in different ways and helping them understand. So Olivia was a student who was quite strong, really, in her math, and she had pretty good conceptual understanding. She had very strong procedural knowledge. And at first I was a little concerned that she wouldn't be challenged in her team, because she had 2 students in her group that were basically struggling learners. But what I realized very quickly was she was absolutely challenged, because she had to think about exactly what she said here, different ways of helping her peers understand, because almost every time they didn't understand her procedural way. So she had to think about this more deeply, and basically her conceptual understanding became a lot more solid because she had to explore it in different ways, especially visually. Kylie said, I can learn the same thing in multiple different ways because my classmates and I all do things differently. Also, if I don't understand someone's explanation, I can try and understand someone else's. And this was a comment, I put this in here because it actually was said in different ways quite consistently. I was surprised at how many students loved doing the same question in multiple different ways. I kind of thought they'd moan and groan about it, but they actually found it really interesting. Payman said that it helped me to see different ways of doing the questions. Also, it made me think and understand different ways of thinking mathematically. And Kyla said, I like groups because if I don't understand how the teacher teaches, I can ask my group members. And I have been saying for years that students can often explain things better to each other than we can, because they're just more alike. Their brains are closer to each other's than they are to the way ours work and think. So I'm a huge proponent of get the students to say as much as possible while the teacher says as little as possible. We did ask in this feedback form, we asked them, this was after a few months of using the teams, we said, would you like to continue using the collaborative teams? We called them math groups. Or would you rather go back to what we were doing before? And I called it, you can see here, I said the traditional teacher-directed style. Now, when I say that, we were not just teaching procedurally. We were using manipulatives. We were using the whiteboards, doing a lot of formative assessment throughout, and having the students do a lot of partner talk. But we basically were leading the classes. So we as the teachers were teaching them the math and allowing them to construct their knowledge and understanding, but we were all moving together sort of as a whole class at the same pace. Now in this class, all of the students chose to continue with the math groups. There was one student that actually chose both, and we actually asked them, they couldn't just tick a box. We said, you know, which style would you prefer, and explain why you chose what you chose. And so she ticked both boxes, and she said that the reason why is because she actually doesn't like the math groups because she hates talking out loud to anybody. And so working in the groups really challenged her. However, from a teacher perspective, I think it was a great way for her to practice getting out of her shell a little bit. Now, benefits for you, the teachers. Again, the most common feedback I got was that teachers were freed up and had way more time to formatively assess their students and to support the learning as it happens. So I don't know if you can relate to this. If your experience is anything like what I've had in the past, then my math class used to be pretty exhausting, because what it would consist of is, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we'd be using the manipulatives and whatnot and walking the students through and using models and trying to develop that conceptual understanding. And as soon as it came time for them to work on a task, a problem, a worksheet, whatever, I would have 6, 7 kids with their hand up immediately. So those are the ones that can't even get started for whatever reason. And oftentimes they're all asking the exact same question. So I would be racing from one student to the next student to the next student, trying to answer their questions and get them started. And before I could even get through all of those students, I would have another handful of students that were done. And I was, you know, frantically scrambling for something for them to do to keep them challenged. So I found that I was sort of in this, it was crazy, busy, and it didn't really feel like I was totally meeting anyone's needs. And the greatest thing about these teams is it eliminates all of that. One of the aspects of the roles in which the students have is that only one person in the team is allowed to ask the teacher for help, and they're only allowed to ask if no one else knows the answer. So all of those common questions you might have to answer once, and then that's it. And they just, the time you spend jumping around from student to student disappears. So you have way more time to walk around your classroom, listen to what they're doing, look at what they're doing, ask them questions, guide them, you know, towards the math thinking that you're trying to lead them towards, to the concept, understanding that concept. And you can also have way more time to work with those struggling learners. If you are a teacher in BC like myself, then the other benefit is, this is a little snapshot of our new curriculum. It's new as in starting now, and using the teams uses all of the competencies as we teach the content, which is the way that the curriculum was designed to be used. So we're integrating the curricular competencies with the content. And when you look at those competencies, you will see that using the team utilizes all of them. I actually am not sure how you could teach all of those competencies if you didn't use an awful lot of partner talk or the teams. And I also heard from the teachers that they were more inspired and less exhausted at the end of the lessons. Here are some quotes from Dom. He was the first teacher that I collaborated with, a grade 6 teacher, and he said it was the kids driving the process. They were driving their learning in a very collaborative way. It empowers the kids, it's student-centered, they're communicating their understanding at a far greater level than just me at the front of the class just choosing students. So again, you know, when we as teachers traditionally, we're up at the front and we ask for students to participate and they put their hands up and we call on certain students. We have no idea about all the rest of those students and their level of understanding. And using the teams forces all of them to participate in that communicating and talking about their understanding. And he said it allowed me to go from group to group and really do a better job of assessing the needs of my students. Darlene is a grade 8 teacher, and she says collaborative math teams has changed my practice. I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I'm going to do this method of teaching for all my units. And Darlene doesn't just teach math. So when she says for all her units, she means for all her subject areas. It was so powerful, and what we noticed, especially in her class and in Dom's class, using these teams changed the entire culture of the class. So it filtered way beyond the math class, and the way in which the students worked together and supported each other and encouraged each other was, it gave me goosebumps. It was really, really powerful. She said, I don't see kids frustrated. My math class was less exhausting, and I felt like I was delivering what I needed to them in a more effective way. So this, again, you have that time to do those formative assessment, activities or questions or whatever you're going to use for that throughout the whole class, so that you can be responsive to their needs. So instead of waiting and marking homework or marking a quiz and then, it's too late to know all the students that didn't have the understanding. This way you can catch all those misunderstandings in real time. So much more beneficial for our students. So when we get started here, I'm going to talk about all these in a bit more detail. And again, I want to reiterate that we are on Educating Now offering a course, and you folks that have signed up for this webinar will be offered a discount. We have just over half of them are up, and the rest are in the studio just being edited. They've all been filmed and the content's all been created. We're just working on the editing process. And the course is a 12-part course, so it goes into everything that I'm going to talk about here in way more detail. Plus it goes into things that I'm not even going to have a chance to talk about here, because an hour simply isn't long enough. So we're going to talk about how to plan our teams, how to lay out the expectations, and the whole process of reflecting and giving feedback, which are key components of the complex instruction that I referred to earlier. So let's start with setting up the teams. Now, the two books that I talked to you about at the beginning have two different approaches. So in Joe Bowler's book, Mathematical Mindsets, where they use complex instruction, they're always done in a team of 4. But in the other book, Math Expressions, they had the students set up in teams of either 3, 4, 5, or 6. I personally preferred teams of 4, but other teachers preferred different numbers of students. So I'm going to leave that one totally up to you, but again, I'm going to suggest what I saw that I thought worked really well. So 4 students per team. Now, this part is crucial though, no matter how many students per team you're choosing. These are mixed ability teams. So we are not going to put, all the strong students together and all the weaker students together. And part of the whole reason that this method of teaching came about was to create equity in the classroom. And it did an amazing job of that. It actually surpassed my expectations. And the great part about approaching math in the teams and with the criteria that we set around how we are now going to be solving math problems. So it's not just about finding one right answer as quick as possible. It's about looking at multiple different representations. And what we noticed with these mixed ability teams is that every student had a strength. And it certainly surprised us, and it surprised us, especially those struggling learners, when they found that strength and were able to be the leader within their team. So again, that's one of those really powerful things. So we want to have mixed ability teams, and each member will have a role. Now, the way in which we organized our teams was different teachers did different things. The one that I liked the best was we had one student who we found was a strong communicator in each team, one that had pretty good procedural understanding of math, and one that had pretty good conceptual understanding of math. And then the 4th member was someone who we hadn't seen a strength in any of those areas yet. So I know a lot of teachers, when I've been doing these webinars now for the last month, and they've been asking, well, how am I supposed to do that when I'm starting the school year? And my suggestion for that, if you're wanting to jump right into this, is talk to previous year's teachers. You can take a look through their file, or wait a week and just watch them, observe them. If all else fails and you're really not sure of their math abilities, you could give them a pre-assessment, and that will give you a lot of information. Or at least make sure you have a strong communicator in each group, because that's what keeps them going. And part of this complex instruction is it gives each student a specific role. So they have specific jobs and responsibilities that they have to do. And that's part of how it keeps them accountable. And sometimes their role is to make sure that everyone in their group is participating. And again, I give you the roles that we created in the course, but I will tell you that they're also in those books that I referred to. And for each teacher that I collaborated with, we changed the roles a little bit, because each teacher had preferences on what they wanted the roles to be in the language that we use to describe the responsibilities. So definitely make it your own. And there is no, set roles, but I do give you in the course the examples that we used. And this is another key piece here. Each member of the team is accountable not just for their own learning, but also each other's learning. And one of the things you will do as the teacher is you walk around the room when they're working in their teams, and you will choose a random member of that team and say, oh, can you explain to me what you've done here or your solution so far? And if they can't, then you let the team know that they haven't actually met your expectations, that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that you're going to come back and see how they're doing afterwards. Because students tend to want to just rush through and just solve the problems and get it done, rather than dig deeper and develop good, solid conceptual understanding. And this is one of the ways that we make sure that no one is getting left behind, or that no student falls between the cracks. And it's really effective. So next, we're going to talk here about building a math culture. This is really crucial. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about all these things that we do to set up, and you're going to hear me say this again. And if you do sign up for the course, you're going to hear me say it a few times throughout that as well. The beginning part of this, it is, you know, there's a lot of work in front loading. You will make up all of that time later on. I promise you, it becomes a lot easier to teach this way and a lot less time consuming. But at the beginning, you definitely have a lot of work to do, and the work is not always around the math itself. And when I worked with every teacher, every single time this happened at the beginning, they kind of give me that deer in headlights panicked look of, we're not going to get through the curriculum. We're not going to be able to get very far if we're going to go this slowly. And it's very slow at the beginning. I promise you, you will make up that time quickly. And different classes have different amounts of times that it takes for the students to gel, but you will make up that time because they become extremely efficient eventually. But before they get there, we need to help them to really understand, A, how to work collaboratively, and B, how to problem solve effectively. So we start by co-creating criteria, and that way we allow the students to be a part of this, because they're the drivers of their own education. And I think it's been the case of the opposite for a long time. I think teachers have been the drivers and the students are in the back of our bus, and we need to reverse those roles, because especially as they get older, they need to be able to advocate for themselves and understand themselves as learners. So part of building that math culture, the place where I always start is on the growth mindset. And if you have never heard about growth and fixed mindset before, then please look it up. There are a ton of free resources online. Carol Dweck is a professor from Stanford, and she's the one that basically discovered this, for lack of a better word, and has been doing research on this for well over 10 years. And the cool thing for me about this is that the neuroscience that we have is improving and growing with the technology that we have every year. So even in the past 2 years, we've learned significantly more about how the brain works and how the brain learns than we've ever known before. And it's so important for us as teachers to know this stuff, because it affects how we do our job. And that's one of my biggest frustrations, is there's all sorts of really valuable and important research that's out there, and it's not getting into the hands of teachers. And that's what I do. That's what I try to do, is get that information into the hands of teachers in a way that they can actually implement it the next day in their classroom. So check out Growth Mindset. Jo Boaler on her site, YouCubed, also has a whole bunch of videos. It's all free on growth mindset. We use those at our school. I love this bulletin board. I think I found this on Pinterest. And what you'll see in the white are kind of the fixed mindset statements that students would make. And on the colored paper are growth mindsets. So in a nutshell, having a growth mindset means that you understand that your effort and your attitude make way more of an impact on your achievement and on your ability to learn than your inherent ability, than what you're born with. So, and we know this from the most successful people in the world are people that have growth mindsets. Here's another image that I found online. And again, it kind of gives you some student statements for growth mindset and for fixed mindset. Take a look at it and see where you're at, because teachers often have very fixed mindsets. I certainly have had noticed that I had fixed mindsets in certain areas. I'm totally working on that. and it's a work in progress for sure. Just so you know, statistically, about 20% of the population has a growth mindset, 20% has a fixed mindset, and the rest of us have a mixture of the two. And teaching about this, I think, is the most important thing we can do. I'm hoping that every teacher in my school jumps on board with this. We have approached it as a whole school, and I think it's a really crucial message. I found for the last 9 years, I've been exploring best practices in mathematics and looking at using manipulatives in language and learning through problem solving and all of these things. But there was always still a few students who just weren't learning, no matter what best practice methods or what great opportunities they had. And a couple of years ago, when I learned about this, I realized that was the missing puzzle piece. If a student has a fixed mindset, their brain physiologically works different. So they don't have as much of an ability to learn as a student with a growth mindset. So this to me is number one priority. And building a math culture goes beyond having the growth mindset. It's also, it's how we, this is actually part of growth mindset. It's how we view mistakes. And traditionally, especially in math, because it's such a performance subject, mistakes have been, students are ashamed or it's embarrassing. And really, I love this. Mistakes allow thinking to happen, because that's mistakes. When you make a mistake, your brain actually grows more than if you do something correctly. So when my students make a mistake, I say, right on, you just got smarter. Now let's look at that, right? So it's not something to be embarrassed about. It's something to explore and to celebrate and to move forward with. So the other thing we need to reframe is struggle. Students, I know I've seen them in struggle and with math, and it used to break my heart. I'd see tears and their heads would go down and they'd give up. And those are all indicators of a fixed mindset. And we need to reframe struggle, because without great struggle, we won't get any great learning. And so when my students get frustrated and they're struggling, I say, oh man, are you frustrated? And they say, yes. And I say, good. And they kind of look at me for a moment and I say, I'm not, being mean. I said, that means that great learning is about to happen. So we just need to help our students to reframe mistakes and struggle from negative things to being positive things that both promote learning. The other piece of this that needs to be there is we need to clearly communicate the learning goals to the students. And this isn't just for math teams, this is just good practice in general, but we need to be really clear with what criteria are we giving them for success. So you can see here's an example. So there's multiple different components that are required when we look at a goal like representing a pattern in a variety of ways. So it's not just using numbers, it's going to be using, visuals and words and maybe in context. One of the things I really love about these teams is we definitely do a blend of discovery learning with some more teacher-directed learning. And what the research tells us about the discovery learning aspect is that if we give students a problem before we teach them the method of how to solve that problem, they will learn that concept better. So we give them a problem. Let's say that you're going to be teaching them about how to add decimals. Instead of starting with a procedure and showing them how to do it and doing a worked example and then giving them a chance to practice, we allow them to try it, to see if they can figure it out. And by the way, they often do. That part really surprised me. And if they don't, they're now primed for learning that procedure that you can teach them or that concept. So really, it allows the students to be active participants in their learning, and they have the opportunity to get their hands on manipulatives, use models, and actually try to authentically solve a problem, because problem solving isn't problem solving if it's something they already know how to do. That's just practicing a procedure. If it's authentic, it's literally a problem to be solved, and they don't know how to solve it right off the bat, and they're going to try and fail and try and fail. Just like I did with learning how to use these teams. We had a lot of error in our trial and error. So the other aspect of discovery learning that I love is that failure encourages students to continue searching for solutions. So we're kind of moving away from the knowledge transfer and emphasizing the result and moving more towards the processes of learning. Those are really those competencies. And I just love this image. I think, again, traditionally mathematics has been taught very rule-based, very procedurally. And so we really focus on the green part, the skills there, rather than looking at it more as this whole interconnected pieces. So your attitudes, that's the growth mindset. Metacognition is the reflection, and goal setting, which we're going to talk about more in a bit here. The processes, those are your competencies, and the concepts. I love that that's on the bottom. To me, it's like the roots, right? Without conceptual understanding, students, you know, if they just have a procedure with no conceptual understanding and they forget the procedure, they're out of luck. Learning stops. They can't go forward. So real mathematical problem solving has to include all of these aspects. Okay, so now let's talk about choosing the right types of problems. This was the area for sure that I had the most error. We had the most error in terms of trial and error. So the one thing I will caution you against is using, now I never did anything like this traditional. This is just sort of an extreme example. But the very first time what we did was the teachers and I collaborated. We created these worksheets, and they're great worksheets. Again, I have all these on offer for you in the course if you're looking for that more detail. And so the worksheets really had students working through the concept. They had to use models with the manipulatives. They were using other pictorial models, like, so they were doing base 10 blocks and number lines, for example, if they were looking at decimals. And they had to explain their thinking, and we were doing in context work, all of that good stuff. But because it was sort of set up as a worksheet that I didn't anticipate them doing it in one class, I was hoping it would take time to do it, but this is basically what happened when we gave them the worksheet. They just all worked independently on their worksheets. They were sitting together in a team, but they weren't communicating, they weren't collaborating, they weren't, you know, using their math reasoning skills to problem solve as a group. And I think this happens for a number of reasons. A, we've kind of trained them to be this way, especially again in math. They're very used to doing individual silent work in math. And so to combat this, you know, we had to do a lot of explicit teaching around what it looks like and sounds like to be collaborators. And that was back to what I mentioned earlier, the co-creating criteria. So when we did that, we created a big chart of the criteria that we all helped to create. We had to continue to remind students about that criteria, and then they had to set goals and reflect, and over time they developed those skills. Dom did something which I thought was quite genius too, to help with this, is he didn't allow them to use a pencil for the first 5 minutes. So they had to work collaboratively together to talk through their ideas and their thinking. Then they could pick up their pencil and start doing some either group collaborating and solving, or a little bit of that individual time before they shared out with their group. And because we were holding them accountable for everybody's learning by doing that check-in that I referred to earlier, when one student was roaring ahead and doing way more of the sheet than the rest of their team, we could correct that. So I would say, though, that doing that style of sheet, it was effective in a lot of ways, but doing it again, I wouldn't give them the whole sheet. I would chunk it up and just do 1 or 2 problems at a time. So then through, again, the opportunity I have to work with different classes, we tried something different, totally different in the grade 8 class. And we used Dan Mayer's blog. He has a bunch of really great tasks like this that are deliberately vague and that deliberately don't have enough information to solve. And the point of that is to really force the students to think about it and realize that there's not just a step-by-step process to solve, that they actually have to discover the meaning of the problem. And they need to come to us and say, hey, we don't have enough information. And he gives you the added information, but it just doesn't come right at the beginning. So here's an example. We use this in a grade 8 class, and technically in grade 8 in our curriculum, we were meant to be exploring percentages larger than 100% and smaller than 1%. But this was really, for us, it was also a diagnostic. It was a pre-assessment, if you will. So we wanted to see, do our students actually do they know how to find percentages of numbers? And if they didn't, then we knew we'd have to do some more direct teaching. So this is what we gave them. Is it better to have 20% off or $20 off? So which coupon should I use? And very quickly, which is exactly what we wanted, students said, hey, we don't have enough information. But what makes the problem the right type of problem then is that it is challenging enough. It is challenging enough that they won't be able to solve it in just a few minutes, but it allows for multiple perspectives and approaches. So if it's something like, like oftentimes the questions in the textbook, they're good for practicing a skill that the students have already developed, but not necessarily for developing the conceptual understanding of that skill. Math Makes Sense does a good job, if you look through the pro guide, of having some of those types of questions. But what you could do if you had a textbook that you really wanted to use is you could actually take a question and take out some of the information to make it more challenging and to make it more vague. And for the students, really, they have to be able to use their math reasoning skills to solve rather than just practicing a procedure. That comes later, the practicing, but right here what we're looking at is how can they construct their own understanding. So first thing we did when we gave them the coupon question is we asked the students to make predictions, and they very quickly, decided that the $100 mark was really important, which was great because that showed that they had some pretty good understanding about percentages. And most of them had a prediction that if the cost of the item, which they knew now that they needed to know, if the cost of the item was more than $100, that 20% was probably going to be the best deal. And if it was less than $100, then $20 off would be the best deal. And we also asked them to determine what further information they needed. And of course, they said, well, we need to know the cost of the item. So we asked them to, after they made their predictions, to make some generalizations based on what they know and basically explain their prediction. So that's, I already explained that to you. They knew that 20% of $100 was exactly $20. So that was sort of the magic number. And because they understood that percentage was proportional, they knew that the more expensive the item, the bigger the discount if they were looking at the 20%. So I said, great, prove that. So you have a good prediction, now prove it. So use what you know to solve this problem. And this is now where we have, so we give them a little bit of time to start solving. And this aspect of, again, this is part of that complex instruction, this was the most challenging for me. And this is where it feels like it goes painfully slow. And again, I'm going to say it does go painfully slow, but this part, this slowing down in order to speed up, is so important. So what we ask the students to do is every 5 or 10 minutes, we stop them. And I got to the point where we had to set a little alarm because I kept forgetting to do this. And the classes where we forgot did not go nearly as well as the classes where we remembered. So it was really important. When you check in with them, you're asking them to reflect on their group learning process. So the first few weeks of this process, the math takes the back seat. And the focus is really on that ability to work collaboratively, because as I said earlier, they do not come to us able to do this well for the most part. They need explicit teaching and reflecting. We've done the criteria, so now they reflect on it and you highlight positive examples. So what that looks like is, as the students are working, you walk around, and I used to just have a little clipboard and I would make notes and I would write down a phrase or things that I heard that was the good stuff, I call it. And so things that I'm talking about, if I see a group that I can, even from far across the room, I can tell that they are like huddling together, so they are physically working well and including each other, I will highlight that. When I hear students say things like, oh, can you explain that in another way, or can you show that in a picture, I highlight that. I always listen for and hope to hear, and I do hear, one brave student that will say to their team, I don't understand that, can you say it again? And I always give that student a special shout out. And I talk about this with the kids. We're asking them to be very vulnerable. And I'm working with grade 6, 7, 8. By the way, this works with any grade level from K right through to 12. and obviously adults. But you know, it's tough for kids to be vulnerable and to admit that they don't understand something in front of their peers. And that's our expectation. And again, that's why we spent the time building that criteria around our supportive math culture, and that it's included in the criteria for collaborative learning, as well as that whole growth mindset. So we really want to encourage that vulnerability, and we need to reward it and praise it when we see it. So I don't highlight any of the negatives I'm seeing. I only highlight the positive examples. And what happens is they start paying attention to and changing how they work together so that they're incorporating all of those positive examples. So this is the actual problem. So this is from Dan Mayer's blog. So the coupon said, you know, which is the better coupon, $20 or 20% off. And the next part of the problem is a list of different items, and it's great. They're all pictures like this. Some of them are, you know, less expensive. They're toys, and then you've got something like this. So I gave the students, this is the first item, is a chair for almost 140 bucks. And we asked the students to solve the problem in as many ways as they could. I even gave them hundreds grids, because it's a percentage problem, to see if that would help them to look at it maybe more visually. As I was walking around, I noticed that there was only one student in the whole class that turned the percentage into a decimal and multiplied by the price of the chair. And I asked her why she did that, and she couldn't tell me. She just said, I just remembered that that's what you do from last year. So to 30 kids, only one of them remembered the procedure. The rest were stumped. So they were doing things like this, which I found interesting. I actually see this a lot, and I'm not totally sure why, but I think it's the out of 100 piece that messes them up, but they do this dividing. And this is when I knew it was time to intervene. So if I had had even one group of students who could have solved the problem successfully, I would have had them come up and share their method with the class. And then I often paraphrase and do a little bit of extra teaching just to make sure the rest get it. We didn't have that in this case. So I knew that it was time for me to do some, you know, direct teaching and help them use a model so that they could create a solution. So I do have to mention, though, that this was, I celebrated the success. I'm sure that you see this as often as I do, but it's one of my biggest pet peeves. I see students just basically computing and calculating all the time in math without ever really thinking about, does my answer make sense? And so I had a student come up to me and say, man, this is what I did. I tried 139.99 divided by the 2/10, and I got $695.95. And she said, I know this is wrong because it makes no sense given the problem. And that is great. And I actually had many students that came up and said a similar thing. So that to me shows great. At least they're now using their number sense, and they're actually checking to see, does this make sense? And it didn't make sense. So at this point, I needed to revisit the meaning of finding percentage of a number. We went through what percentage meant. Most of the class was good with that. So we looked at a visual model. And if we look at this entire square as the one whole, 100% of the cost of the chair, which is $139.99, I rounded it to 140 to make it easier. Then we could look at, well, what does one little square represent? Well, that's our 1%. Can we use that to help us find 20%? And because students could see it visually, they realized very quickly that one square would be equal to about $1.40, and from there they could figure out 20%. So I put them back into their teams after showing them that model, and I didn't walk them through how to solve it. I just got them started. And there was all sorts of aha moments. Students were realizing, oh, I can take the price and divide it into 100 little pieces. They found that visual model very helpful. And because they didn't have a solid understanding of this, I did more than one of these. So I basically put aside the chair problem for the moment. And this is what I mean by teacher agility. So I put aside that problem. We looked at the missing skill or misremembered skill. And again, we want conceptual understanding. So I didn't just teach them a procedure. I didn't say, oh, just turn the percentage to a decimal and multiply. I wanted them to figure out a way of solving conceptually. And that's where the model comes in. And by the way, if you've never seen manipulatives or visual models for this type of math, our website, Educating Now, has video tutorials for teachers on how to teach this way. So we go through the different number concepts with whole numbers, decimals, fractions, algebra as well, and how to teach it using manipulatives and specific language that helps students to develop conceptual understanding. So you can check out our site if you're interested in that. So we did more of these, we explored different ways, and then I always ask, well, you know, is this really efficient by taking a box and cutting it up and figuring out one square? Are there more efficient ways? And in this case, very few of the students understood that traditional method, which gave me some really good information about their level of understanding and lack of understanding with certain concepts here. So we eventually returned back to the original problem. They now have the skills, they solve it, and they check to make sure that their solutions are reasonable. And they could prove that their original prediction was in fact correct, because they did now prove that 20% off of items that were more expensive than $100, the 20% off coupon was a better deal, and anything that was under $100, the $20 off was a better deal. So last thing we're going to talk about here, and by the way, don't forget to ask questions. Please feel free to do that, is how this approach differentiates struggling learners. So for struggling learners, first of all, they get the help they need as they need it. They are constantly supported, encouraged, and taught by their peers. These kids need one-on-one help, and we know that, and we just can't get to them because there's 30 of them and one of us. And I think one of the reasons why struggling learners continue to fall further and further behind is because they're opting out. They're not really participating. And so then they just keep getting further behind. And these teams make it so they have to participate. So they're constantly being supported and encouraged by their peers, and they're getting the help they need as they need it. And honestly, I was totally blown away by some of the achievement, especially these struggling learners. I've never seen students learn so much in such a quick amount of time. That's part of why I spent my summer creating this course, because it was so powerful and so effective. Again, they can't opt out. They all have that job to do. And all of them can participate, even if it's at a minimal level. So students, even that have significant learning difficulties, can still participate in this. And again, I talk a lot more about this in our course. So our strong students are also benefiting from this approach, and they were the ones I was the most concerned about, but the research actually shows they benefit the most because they are teaching and explaining, and also because they are challenged to have to come up with multiple different ways to try to help their team members to understand, including visuals, which is often a challenge. Some of our quote unquote strong students are quite strong procedurally, but maybe not so much conceptually, and they don't necessarily know what it actually means, and this helps them to develop that conceptual understanding. I love this image. It's, again, it's how and why we differentiate as educators. We can't just give everybody the same thing, because to be fair doesn't necessarily mean to be equal. So we need to adjust to meet our students' needs, and this image shows that really nicely. Okay, so in this webinar today, we looked at students are engaged. We use positive peer pressure to help them stay engaged and to continue to motivate them to learn. We all know as educators that success breeds success, and that's what happens here. They're able to understand the math, and then they become a lot more confident and eager to learn more. We know that the skills, those competencies, communication, collaboration, problem-solving skills, creative thinking, all of those competencies are really, really important, and for just life in general, not even just school, but also school. So we're teaching those skills at the same time as the content. We want to make sure we're using challenging problems that can be solved in multiple ways, And obviously sometimes they're too challenging and teachers might need to intervene when needed. And as far as my experience goes, this is the best way I've seen to differentiate. It's the best way to really meet way more of the learners' needs in the same classroom when there's one of you and a whole bunch of them. So if you enjoyed this webinar, if you found this valuable, please like us on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. I'm at Nikki Lynham. Make comments. We really want to get the word out for teachers on how to use these teams, and just want people to give it a try because it was so powerful for us. We are going to be sending you an email, and it will have a link that looks like this when you click on it. And as you can see here, we are offering you 45% off the original price. So once you click through, it will automatically deduct that for you. It's normally $249. So you will have access to that for $136.95. And again, that course is a 12-part. This we added one since the screenshot was taken. So you can see here, this is what it looks like. There are resources along with the videos. Each of these lessons or lectures has a video, as well as some of them have lesson plans. They have resources, posters, all sorts of things to help you get up and running. The idea with this course is it's going to give you everything you need, all the nitty-gritty details. Okay, so at this point, we're going to go to the questions. I haven't heard Hugo come in yet.
Yeah, we've actually got no questions so far.
Okay, great. Well, if you do have any questions, if you've had a chance to think about this, and even if you want to start trying some things out in your class and you have some questions, please don't hesitate to email me at nikki@educatingnow.com. And again, check out our site. We have teacher resources for grades 4 through 8, as well as the collaborative learning course. So we have lots on offer to help you teach math more meaningfully. Thanks for joining us, and good luck with the teams in your classrooms.
Thanks, everyone.